Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith, and as you can see, dear listeners, dear subscribers, no chattering teacup, no furry overlord, but here with me from across the pond is physician and author Audrey Birnbaum. Hello Audrey and welcome at Book Lovers Companion.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me on your show.
It's a pleasure to have you on, and after reading your book, I'd say we have a lot to talk about.
I hope so, and I'm excited to speak. I do that.
Wonderful. The title of your book is called American Wolf, From Nazi Refugee to American Spy, and it came out in September 2023. Is that correct?
I believe it's October, but yes, You're in the ballpark. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's dive right in. What can you tell our listeners about your book?
Well, my book is a true story, and it is basically an account of my father's harrowing escape from Nazi Germany in 1941, his dangerous immigration to the United States and difficult transition to American life, and then his extraordinary return to Germany as an American spy in the middle of the Cold War. That's the nutshell version.
And the experiences he had while being a boy, in Germany, and the beginning of this Third Reich, so to speak. At the start, it is slow. His parents think, it might go away, or let's be hasty with going away and moving to another country. And I got the impression that they waited very long to leave the country because it was their home. It's where they felt comfortable, where they made a life for themselves. And how do you think he experienced it from a boy's perspective, looking back on his notes he left you?
So Edith, that was one of the things I think that's unique about this book is that it is written from a child's perspective. My father was born in 1930, and his first memories were 1933, just when Hitler came into power. And I found notes that he had kept that he wrote when he was already late in life, like in his probably early 70s. And he had unbelievably vivid details of his life growing up in Germany. I think, the trauma of what he experienced created very lasting memories. And I hadn't read, obviously, many accounts of the Holocaust, but I had never read such vivid childhood accounts of the sort of decline in life in Germany and the sort of epicenter of what was going on. And he was very late to get out of Germany in 1941. So living through this sort of gradual descent into darkness, to sort of loss of freedoms and this sort of lonely existence as they lost their citizenship and had to escape and were desperately trying to escape was something I hadn't read before. And how they got out, those difficulties they encountered, and the bureaucratic obstacles were something that I had never faced before. And ultimately, they did escape by ship, and I didn't realize it was the last ship out of continental Europe. And I had never read about these ships either. That was, they were important enough to make news reports, but they weren't anything I had really read about. So he had really gifted me with these incredible details from which I was able to create a very exciting story. I mean, I created it, but he really had given me all the tools for which I was able to do it. And I opted to do it in the first person voice, because it was the only way that I could really find that I could get the reader enmeshed in the experience of living through it in real time.
I suppose it is more intimate that way, because every narration in first person is more intimate for the reader.
I felt so. I actually had tried to do it in third person. I tried to do it in present, but I ended up doing it in past tense. But in first person. So I tried a lot of different ways over quite a few years to do it until I felt like the tone right. And it was for me very emotional to do it in his voice because ultimately, as I was writing it, I felt like I was living through it
Yeah.
myself and experiencing it. And sometimes I thought I was him and I was the character. And sometimes I would say, my uncle or my mother, and I'd be, no, no, it's not my uncle. It's my father's uncle. Then I would be talking about some of the sort of tragic characters that
Mm,
he either had to separate from or he lost like during, the experience. So it was, yeah, it was quite an emotional journey out.
mhm.
Um,
And did you feel during the writing process, did you feel even closer to your father while writing this?
Absolutely. We had, my father having experienced the war and loss and a lot of trauma. I would say that I did not grow up as a normal person. Can I say that?
Yeah,
I did
yeah.
not a typical way. I mean, I think some of it was also like, first generation immigrants,
Hmm.
things that I think a lot of people can recognize. So in a way, a lot of the story feels like an immigrant tale, that I think people could read for any immigrant standpoint. But I think there were other things that were very specific to his trauma, and he had some very unusual relationships with loss and with money.
Mm,
So we grew up in a very state of imagined dire poverty that was very hard for my sister and I.
mm,
And we really thought we were absolutely poor the way we lived. Picking out dented cans from the supermarket and going to this day old bread store and deny a lot of denial of things. And it was hard for us, as American kids to always like not have things. And it created, like, I think for us, like a lot of um, sadness and anger and things, which we might not have had if we were poor, but there was a point where we realized that we weren't. And it was just a style of living for which we thought was being imposed on us.
mm,
And I think we had made peace with it at some point, but I don't think we understood the roots of it, nor could have until I sort of read through what he had suffered and lost, um, and done without, starvation and loss and, coming here with $10 in his pockets. Um, I think it's hard to imagine what that does to a person and the fear of losing and the need to sort of control everything and keep it
yeah.
all together, including keeping his family close and saying, no, you can't go away to school and you can't, a lot of this was just really fear of losing,
Mm,
constant fear of losing everything, so I think I didn't really appreciate that till I went through this in detail and really understood it.
mm. I can understand it because I've heard of people, I've known people who kept tins of food stored away because they were afraid of experience hunger again and starvation again and being tied with their money because, like you said, they experienced this loss and they felt the need to cling on and in case something bad happened again.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was conscious. I mean,
Yeah,
but there were times when we closed our freezer with duct tape. I mean, because there was so much stored in it.
yeah,
And I don't think it was a sense of conscious awareness of like, well, just in case we run out of food. It wasn't like we kept a storage bin somewhere, but I think that I mean, on some subconscious level, there was that sense of like, you never know when we might need to, who knows? I think
mm,
that we always live with that. And I think my sister and I have inherited that a bit. We try not to admit to it. So we try to get therapy, but it doesn't always work. Well, it's in there somewhere. But
yeah. I mean, it's understandable what you learn from your parents and so on. You always swear I'm not going to be like this, and yet, in a way, you know, when you grow older, you realize, oh, I'm not so different.
yeah, no, it's up there. It's right. It's there. I just don't know how much we passed on, but hopefully it gets diluted a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, and I also understand it. And when he comes to the United States, he's still a boy, and he has to learn to embrace this new country, this new culture, and also when he goes back to Europe and Germany after the war, and he how shall I put it? He gets reacquainted with his past and the culture he came from, and I got the impression a little bit that he felt like a wanderer between cultures. Maybe I'm completely wrong.
No, you're completely right. And the title of the book is very much a reflection of that. American Wolf, could be construed as a nature book, but it's not. My father's given name was Wolf. He did
Yeah.
change it to Jack when he got here. And, when he landed on this soil, as many young people do, they want to shed their old identity and become Americanized. And when he had a school interview, the assistant principal said to him, "Wolf, you've got to get rid of that name. You'll be teased mercilessly." And she said, "Do you have a middle name?" And he said, "Yes, I do. It's Joachim." She said, "No, not at all. Get rid of it." So she said, "We could change it to Jacob." And he was like, "No, it's that sounds too Jewish."
Mm-hmm.
And so they settled on Jack, which was like, it's a perfect American sounding name. But there was this homesickness too for Germany, which a lot of people who were Jewish didn't understand. They were denouncing everything that was German, but people who came from Germany, there was hatred of the Germans, but their identity was German. After all, they had assimilated.
Yeah.
So there was this constant struggle between trying to become American and fit in, which they didn't. And in fact, people in America they hated the Japanese, they hated the Germans, they called him a Nazi, even though he was escaping the Nazis. So there was a sense of never fitting in. American Jews didn't like German Jews. Eastern European Jews thought German Jews were snobby, which they were. There was this, constant identity crisis that I think he never really resolved. And at some point, when he went back to Germany as a soldier, I think he thought at some point he would just own it and realize that he was sort of a hybrid, and he was just going to have to, own that identity, that he was never ever going to really be an American. He was never going to be accepted as a German, especially as a Jew, and he was going to fall somewhere in the middle always. And I think that's kind of how he lived his life, with a sort of his reaction formation, as I would say in psychology, was to take some pride in his Germanness, because it distinguished him in some way. Even as a Holocaust survivor, had some kind of perverse pride in that as a distinguishing feature, which, again, some people never talked about it. He did talk about it, but he never really described his experiences to the extent that my sister and I understood. So until we read, after he died, until we found his memoirs and read through it, we really didn't know the extent of all that he had been through. Which, so it was quite a find. I felt that the story was riveting enough to put down on paper with no writing skills of any kind whatsoever, other than a consult note about diarrhea or something like that, because I was a gastroenterologist. So
no, I think it, I think it transports perfectly fine and perfectly vivid what he experienced and how he experienced it. It's fantastically written. And we said before we started the recording, there are a few things that stood out. Which are on the one hand tragic, on the other hand they are a bit funny. When I told you I loved this naughty parrot, which his sisters had at home, and I also loved the one scene where your grandmother and your aunt are talking about her future husband, and where your aunt Anita is thinking about, should she marry him, should she not marry him, and your grandmother sits her down and asks her, what is stopping you? And your aunt is saying, yeah, well, our background is this, his background is that. Okay, whatever, next. And what other reasons do you have? And then she says, well, it's about his family and those jobs and so on. And that's one of the points your grandmother sees as a problem.
Yes, sloth. So my grandmother is the hero and villain of this book because she is a difficult, neurotic, insecure, tough woman who was a little bit abusive to my father's sister, who was considerably older than him, who encouraged my father's sister, my aunt, to marry a man twice her age in the hopes that he was a Chinese man, in the hopes that maybe they could immigrate to China when it didn't look like they could get visas to America, who drove my grandfather nuts, possibly leading to his early demise. And yet she had the tenacity to get them out of Germany. And if it wasn't for her pursuing every angle, without question, my family would not have survived. So, but she was, she could be perceived as a, can I say, I don't know what we can say on air. She was a tough woman, and she worked. The only thing that was valued in my family was hard work, and she was a social striver. She come from a tough background, and she was intent on, you have to earn money, and you have to be ambitious, and you have to do something with your life. And the one thing she could not tolerate was sloth. And anything was considered sloth, including, relaxing. And I mean, if I didn't inherit that, I cannot tell you, my sister and I look at each other like, wow, you do not sleep late. You do not nap in the middle of the day. You do not sit still. And we really, and that's how we grew up, and we do not sit still ever. Ever. It's not clear that we even sleep at night. It's not. I do my best work, around 2 a.m. or so. So she instilled that sense of drive, which is, completely pathological, but also very productive. So I don't know. Is it good? Is it bad? I don't know. You tell me.
I'm not sure because
there's a middle ground.
Yeah, but I think of my own grandmother, and she was a bit similar to that, because she came from a farmer's family, and she had to work for farmers very early. And when they got back from school, all the children had to work on the fields and so on. And if she wanted something done, it had to be done now. You couldn't say to her, yeah, we'll do it, just sit down. No, now.
Yeah, I know. It's hard, but there's something to be said, when I'm sitting in my backyard and I'm trying to relax, but I see a weed, and I must get the weed now, it's not a very relaxing state of mind,
Yeah.
So I admire her moxie, and I admire her drive. But yes, when my aunt found a nice, soft, sweet man to marry, finally, there was this fear that his family was not, they're not driven and not ambitious. And, the very things that you love are the things that will drive you crazy at some point in your life. And I'm sure it did. But I don't know enough about my aunt's family. Unfortunately, my aunt died when I was, she was in her 70s, but it's many years back. And a lot of her story is untold. A lot of the details of what she suffered, which I'm sure could make a book itself. I didn't have those details. I knew her story as my father knew it, but I'm not sure that he knew everything story.
Yeah, it would absolutely make a book on its own, because the little tidbits you shared in your book are quite fascinating. And I mean, I can't even imagine what it was like for her.
I know I can't. I mean, there were a lot of, again, obstacles that I went through in the book that the U.S. put up to immigration. That,
Mm,
my father, till his dying day, thought they just had really bad luck and it was very bureaucratic, and maybe the U.S. was just, who knows? Like they said, oh, the visa's delayed. We put you on a Polish quota instead of a German quota, so it's slower. And that had to do with where my grandparents were born, in a part of
yeah,
Prussia that ended up
yeah,
being part of Poland. So, and then they said, oh, you have some health issues you have to resolve before you get your visa. And then they said, we're giving you 3 visas, not 4. So they had to figure out
yeah,
what to do. And so they sent my aunt to England as an au pair, which did not quite work out. But they did not know that and I only found out after watching the Ken Burns documentary
mhm,
about the U.S. involvement, the U.S. and the Holocaust,
mhm,
that the State Department had sent information to all of the uh, uh, consulates to delay. I
okay,
think postpone, delay,
okay,
delay, delay,
yeah,
or do whatever you can, not fulfill the visas that they had. They had the spots, but they said, whatever you do, delay, delay, delay. And so they were intentionally, they lost the documents and
yeah, yeah,
so it was, under dire circumstances, they were not letting people in.
mm, yeah. Countries back then, I'd say they have a lot to answer for, not just the Americans in this case, because Switzerland also might have a bit to answer for how they behaved, but
Well, it's not, it's turning a blind eye to a catastrophe or a genocide or a thing going on in another part of the world is not, it happens.
yeah,
This was a very large scale,
yeah,
but things like this really happen all the time, and a lot of times the world has chooses not to watch,
yeah,
and that just is the nature of the world and human.
unf yeah, unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
And it was also interesting to read this part about when he came back to Germany and how he became a spy and how they did it. I mean, being in Eastern Germany at the time must have been nerve-wracking.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think for my father, it was uh, I think he didn't really realize the risks until he was eventually picked up by the Russians. I think he was young enough to think this is fun, and I feel like James Bond books had come out already, so
Yeah.
he had these little mini cameras and little recording devices, and they were supposed to be. It was just past the Korean War, and
Yeah.
there was this huge fear that the Russians, had more technological advancements over us, and we needed to figure out like what kind of tanks they had, and they should be taking pictures and surveilling them, and he thought it was fun, and he learned how to drive like a spy, and he just thought it was the first time in his life he had ever been cool. I mean, if you read back in the story, you're like, this is not a cool man. This is a man who has been made fun of and teased, and he's lost all of his friends in Germany. Most of his friends that he
Mm,
lived with on his block were Christian, and they all dumped him because the Nazis told them to. And then he came here, and they all made fun of him because he was foreign, and he was left back because he didn't know the language.
yeah.
And then he was like, suddenly he goes to uh, Germany, and he's an American intelligence officer, and the people there think you're so cool. And he, finally, for the first time in his life, like, I'm cool. So it was a great, like, for a story that's also a coming of age story, the ability to suddenly feel like a man, and have a relationship. He had a relationship with an older woman who was very hot. It was a great time for him until the Russians picked him up. And then he was like, shit. this could end badly. I think people disappear, go to gulags and things. So it
Yeah.
was a a little bit of a awakening that this was maybe not so safe. But luckily he got out of a jam and made it back home. And although my father's memoirs took him to the present, um, when he wrote them, I guess he wrote it in I don't know when he wrote it, maybe 1990 or something like that. But I decided that this book should end with his return to America and finding my mother and finding
Hmm.
love and acceptance with my mother. I thought that was a good, um, you know, way to that had to be an end somewhere. So I thought that was a good way to end it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got the impression we spoke about your grandmother, and not just your grandmother, but the other females, like your mother and so on. There's a lot of female strength in his memoir, in his recollections.
Um, oh, that's interesting. I didn't really think about it in that way. Um, Tell me what you're alluding to and what you saw in it.
Well, for one thing, his sister, how they relied on her knowledge, the knowledge she had gathered, and relying on her as a strong person to help them out. First, before they sent
Yeah.
her to England, then when they reunited in the United States, but also, like you mentioned, your grandmother, how she kept on pushing, making sure they are part of society, how they accumulated a living, how they went on in life, and how they got better. And that's what she did when they lived in Germany. That's what she did when they came to the United States. She was a driven woman, but she also had this inner strength.
Yes, I think that's true, but I think what I noticed, I think exactly my grandfather. I don't want to exclude him. My grandfather was more of a dreamer. He was
Mm.
very playful, very jocular, and I think that that was a strength. Also,
Hmm.
I think first of all that combination of personalities was very good for my father growing up. I think that. Um, when my father used to talk about his stories, he told them almost like adventure stories to me, like
Mm.
about their train ride that they had to take across war-torn Europe to get to
Yeah.
their ship. And of course, there's a whole story about their visas expired because their ship was delayed and they had to find another ship. It's
Mm.
quite at an edge of your seat adventure about how they finally got out.
Yeah.
But I suspect that my grandfather kept my father's spirits up. My father was only 11 and must have made it seem like an adventure because that's how my father describes it. So,
Mm.
other than my father sitting in cowering in fear,
Mm.
my grandmother must have been nervous. I think she was a nervous woman. My grandfather must have said, this is an adventure. We're traveling at night. My father was hungry. How did he keep from being scared and
Mm.
of, and fearing for his life? Well, by you have a father who is telling you jokes and stories. I feel this must have been how it was, just because he was a character.
Yeah.
And also, like during Kristallnacht, my grandfather was almost deported,
Mm.
and he avoided it by with crazy antics. Like he went to a hospital to try to get himself admitted, and he created a scene and an imaginary illness to get himself admitted to the hospital so he wouldn't get deported. So his craziness and fun was a great counter to my grandmother's nervous anxiety and drive. But yes, when they came here, like they were like, we have to get jobs. We have to start
Yeah.
working right away.
Yeah.
But I think my grandfather's personality was ill suited for life here. That you can't be funny in another country with no language and working in a basement. And then, he made it to busboy, but I mean, he really sank into a depression. I think
Mhm.
um, he really needed to be surrounded by uh, his people. And my
Mm.
grandmother, I think, isolated him a little bit. she broke she was always sensing insults from people, and she broke ties with a lot of relationships that they had. So instead of, I think I changed my mind on immigration a lot after reading this. I used to think like, oh, it's really good when you immigrate to assimilate, right? Learn the new language and, you know, but then I said, no, it's actually good to live in a community where your other um, emigres live and be able to speak your own language when you're middle aged. The young people will assimilate. They'll learn English. They'll become Americanized. But the older people, they need to be in their community because the homesickness is so great. And the difficulty in establishing new roots is so hard that the only way to avoid a depression and displacement is to feel a sense of home in your community. And so I do feel that my grandfather would have fared better had he not been isolated from a community of peers.
Mm.
So I know I diverged a little bit from what you were saying. I'm so sorry. I lost my light. Let me just grab that for a second.
Don't worry.
All right, I kicked out my light. Can you still see me? My apologies. I'm in darkness. Maybe it's better that way. So I think that he would have fared. Yeah. So, but as far as like driven women, my father's sister Anita, who was 9 years his senior, was like a second mother to him.
Mm.
And she was more nurturing, perhaps, than his own mother. And so when they were in New York, and my grandparents were in the middle of terrible marital issues, my grandfather was so depressed it was intolerable to be at home.
Yeah.
He would escape to my aunt who lived on the Harlem and who had twin children, and he would go there to just get a breath of air and $1 to pocket, because otherwise it was pretty miserable at home. So she was a great. She was not mentally healthy herself, but she was a relief to my father.
Mm. Do you think that in a way, despite all her nervousness, your grandmother was in essence a bit more resilient?
Yes, I think that was her for survival. Her resilience was her playing card. Was yeah. I mean, I think you had to have resilience in that period to survive, without doubt. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned you've been to Germany. And what about research for the book? I mean, did you go for the research as well, or did you just check the internet for the research, or how much research did you think is necessary to do everything your father wrote justice? What can you tell us about that?
So I've been to Germany a few times. My father took us quite a few times. I mean, 4 or 5 times, I'd say. The last trip I took was quite a few, maybe like 7, 8 years ago. So I didn't go back specifically for this writing of this book. I did a lot of genealogy research. My father did not know what happened to his family members. To him, they had disappeared. He didn't have internet access at the time that he wrote his memoir, so he could not. He didn't have access to like the Holocaust Memorial Museum, which had already accumulated information on. He had relatives who they said they were. He knew they went on transports, but didn't know what happened to them afterwards. He didn't know if they had been in concentration camps or whatever. So I was able to locate names of uncles he didn't remember. So he just said it was my uncle. He had a best friend that he left behind, that he had wandered the streets of Berlin during the 1940 and 41. And I found out that he had died he had first concentration stat and then died in Auschwitz. I was able to find his full name. So a lot of that. I also fact checked. My father thought of himself as somewhat of a historian, so he had included a lot of very good history details about the war, but he didn't have all his facts correct. So I had to fact check those too. So I would say that I'm still doing research. Like he had a landlord who was very helpful to them. I did not get to include information about the landlord and found out that he was a very famous art historian and professor who actually was not just helpful to their family, but was helpful to the community at
Mm-hmm.
large, and sort of an
Mm-hmm.
anti-Nazi
Mm-hmm.
person. I don't have the good
Yeah.
words for that right now. So yeah, there was a lot of research, but most of it, yes, internet genealogy. I worked with a a genealogist.
Mm.
I found living relatives I didn't know I had, second cousins, um, in Chicago. Coincidentally, a block from my son who lives in Chicago. That was a total coincidence and strange. But yeah, so I would say it was a great experience to find just all of this. It felt like a living history, I
Yeah.
guess, would be. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. And what was your first impression during your first visit when you visited the country of your father and mother?
Well, my mother's from here.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, sorry, your grandmother. Sorry, your grandmother and your father's country. Sorry about that.
My first
How?
impression,
Yeah, what was your
you
first
say?
impression setting foot into Germany for the first time?
So it's hard for me to say. So I went as a child, so it's hard for me to say my first impression because my father, again, very excited to be like, "This was my apartment. This is where I lived on 103 Schillerstrasse." So there was never any like negative feeling
Yeah.
about it.
Okay.
But I would say that I combined, I wrote the story again in my father's voice, but it's not entirely his story. It's a merger
Yeah.
of voices.
Yeah.
So, for example, when my father had written that his mother would check his stool for parasites,
Yeah.
but when I was in Germany, I was also as a gastroenterologist, I was very taken by the German toilets and how they were designed. So I combined like my impression of German toilets with his description of his mother looking at his feces, and I put the two together and used it to describe how she looked at his feces in the German toilet. It's kind of like a combination. And I think I did that in a lot of places, like when I knew my American grandparents and how they lived. So I described my impression of them with in his eyes. So it's not like he wrote that, but I merged the
Yeah.
two impressions, my observation and his experience kind of combined. But Germany, I love Germany. And that's when I sort of learned that I knew the language. Like
Mm.
I go and bought strawberries with my daughter when I was visiting, and they're like, Führen Pimsisch. And I'm like, oh, okay, I know that. How do I know that? It's like really like the words were in my head. And I realized that I absorbed my father's language talking to my grandmother in German, and somewhere it was in some recesses in my brain. And I'm like, oh, I think I might know some German.
Yeah.
And then I started learning, which I wanted to do for the book anyway, learn some of the language
Mm.
to make it
Mm.
authentic, where especially the German earthing parrot.
Yep.
uh,
Absolutely.
yeah.
The absolute fun part in the book, because the shock your father realized, oh good lord. Yeah, well, it's fun for me as someone who has German as a first language. It was really fun reading that.
Oh, good. I'm glad it was authentic.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mhm.
And like I said before, even naughtier in German a bit. The German words a tiny bit naughtier. And looking back on putting this book together and writing in first person voice, I mean, the whole book was probably quite a challenge for you, but looking back on it, what was the hardest part? What was the most challenging part during your writing process?
Um, uh, I think for me, the most challenging part was, uh, again, just making it feel like you're there. So,
Mm.
when my father would write something, it was always like a telling. We would go shopping and we would go, every day we would go shopping and we would go to the stores and we would do this, we would do that. But of course, like that's not anything anyone would want to read because that's interesting description, but how would you weave that into a readable
Mm.
story
Mhm.
that, or he would tell this story about like how he visited his cousin and they had a parrot. Okay, that's a nice little vignette, but how do you make that part of a whole narrative? People write down their memories of something that was like exciting for them, but how do you weave that into a comprehensive story and make it and bring the reader in, especially as somebody like me who doesn't have any experience as a novelist.
Mm.
And um, and in the end, I can't tell you how I did it, except that I kept redoing it until it felt um, right. I kept working on it
Yeah.
um, till I felt like if I read it, if I was the reader, that it felt like it had enough detail and vividness and color and dialogue to be interesting. I can't even say exactly how I did it, but there was a lot of rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. I mean, it's a lot of time and work to build it and make it feel. I wanted to feel almost like historical fiction, even though it's not
Mhm.
fiction, but that it
Mhm.
would read as if it's like a novel.
Yeah.
Um, so, well,
Mhm. And did you also have some sort of beta readers, or not at all? Or did you ask your family, "Come on,
it was friends and
everyone."
family. Just friends and family. um, yeah, it's just. I mean, I didn't have any outside help.
Okay.
I mean, I'm pretty good at like grammar and with the language, I'm pretty good and like doing my own editing. But
Mhm.
as far as just I had readers from my little book club, my pandemic book club. they, they read it. And and then even after my publisher read it, and then she said, "Well, it's going to be a few months before we publish it." I kept rewriting it because
Mm.
I'm a perfectionist, and I kept thinking this isn't good enough, and even now when I read it, I'm like, I could have written that sentence better. I could have written that paragraph better. And I still wasn't certain about it until it got, it was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Awards this,
Mhm.
this year, and until it got external accolades, I still thought, no, it's not good enough. Or like after it gets to this country, will people still want to read it? They made it out alive. Do people still want to read more? But they both said they did. So
Yes, absolutely. And from the reader's point of view, it pulls you in. The story pulls you in,
I'm
and you want,
glad to hear you say that.
e- yeah, absolutely, and you want to go on and find out how he copes with everything that is thrown at him as a boy in a new country, and how his family is going to cope with it, and what's happening in Germany when he gets to Germany. It was a fascinating story, and you did a wonderful job.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Ab-
I really
Absolutely.
wanted to tell his story, and I think like it's not. I hope it want to belittle in any way Holocaust stories, but I also feel like, well, it's not just a Holocaust story.
Mm.
Um, it's a lot of things: coming of age,
Yeah.
immigration, prejudice, triumph of the human spirit, all that stuff. And there's always a need for those kinds of personal stories, but mostly to be moved.
Mm.
You either have to be educated or moved. I think it does a little bit of both. So
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well done. From the reader's point of view, absolutely well done. And now that you have experience as a writer of stories like this, what would be your advice for other writers?
um, So I think that one is always like writing things down whenever they happen because you think you'll remember, but you don't. I'm sure Larry David must have done this. It's like, you're having an experience and just in real life and something amusing or funny, and you just write it down, just jot it down, even on your phone or something. And because you'll use that somehow or somewhere, you're on vacation somewhere and, something happens that it's just because mostly you're going to write about human experiences um, that are real. However, you
Yeah.
decide to put that, even if you're writing a historical book or a period piece, it doesn't matter. You're writing about. I just saw Macbeth with Ray Fine in Washington D.C., and I'm watching it, and I'm like, oh, this is so current. Because this is real human drama about all the things that motivate people.
Yeah.
With power, there's mental illness, there's all these things. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so relevant today. So,
Yeah.
so anything like you see in your daily life, any vignette that you see where somebody's what people's motives are is relevant. So yes, I'd say jot everything down. Second, don't worry about how it sounds because I'm convinced when I read great fiction that with wonderful sentences that it didn't come out that way the first time because it took me so many times to rewrite till I was happy with what I had. So I know it doesn't. I don't think great writers it always just like comes out perfect. It probably takes a few iterations, a few attempts. And so don't be too self-critical. Just get it down on paper. And uh, yeah, I think that's would be my. I don't work from an outline. I mean, I have an idea of what I want to write, but I think that for me, I think when you have the characters and you know who they are and what motivates them, then they kind of write themselves. So I think having your characters for me is the most important thing because they will drive the narrative. They almost speak for themselves.
True. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And what are your plans for the future? Because you are working on book number 2 already.
I am. It's been slower to start. I mean, I started very quickly, and then the um, the marketing of this book took more energy than I expected. So it was a little bit of it's probably a lame excuse, but it was a little bit of a distraction from. But yes, I had started working on a book that was a fiction book that was an ensemble cast of characters from different walks of life on a vacation, coming together, a little bit mystery, a little bit comedy, all very human. Again, lots of flawed characters. Lovely adventure story, and I am in the middle of it, and I will eventually finish it, and and I will publish it, and that's my plan. And I was so surprised. I was a doctor for over 35 years, and if you asked me when I wanted to become a doctor, I would have said, "Oh, well, 11, I must have said it." And I've always wanted to be a doctor. And then about a month ago, I found the 6th grade like autograph book, where people write roses are red, violets are blue, you're ugly, a little stupid book from graduation. And on the back it said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it said writer. And I thought, what? I was 11. And I thought, well, I guess being a doctor was my hobby. And now I'm finally in my intended career. So I guess it's not too late.
It's never too late.
I guess
It's absolutely not. Oh, becoming a writer you can never be too late with becoming a writer, I suppose. No.
Yeah. I mean, I hope I live long enough to write a few books.
Oh, absolutely. And if you have, there is this need. If you want to be a writer, there is this need to get all the voices in your head out on paper, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, when you say all the voices in my head, it does sound like a little bit of a mental illness, but I will hopefully, no, I do. I mean, yes, I know. I'm the litter of voices. I know.
Yeah.
But yes. I have other voices in my head too, but they, they're stuck in there. Uh, but yes, I think that, yeah, I'm always thinking about, I think like as an like artists too, they probably look at things and say, how would I draw that? Or how would I paint that? But I think a lot of times I'm walking around and thinking, how would I write that? And if it's not in this book, it'll be in another,
Oh,
or it'll
yeah,
be a short story or something.
absolutely, because those
And
voices,
even if it's not,
yeah, exactly. But even if those, like we said, those voices are not a mental illness, but you have to get them out and you have to put them on paper one way or the other, because otherwise, at one point you have to put them on paper. It's this need to do that.
yes, exactly. Right.
And
Otherwise
do you,
it's crowded in there.
yes, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And may I ask how this happens for you? Because one author said to me he always found it strange when other people said, other authors, other writers said they have this character looking over the shoulder. He thought it, you know, what is he or her talking about? But then when he started writing his own novel, he realized they were true. That's not something fancy, you know, idea, but it is true in a way that your characters look over your shoulder and they agree or they disagree. Is that something you have experienced yet yourself or not?
No, it doesn't work like that for me. For me, it's a very visual experience. Like what
Mm.
I experienced was that I felt like I was in movie, or
Mm-hmm.
or like for some people, I might say like in a dream or in a movie. So I would be, let's say, if I was writing about, I'll say the parrot, for example, I would be in the room. I would see the room. I would see the parrot. I would see the other characters. I would I would be the person. It was as if, yes, it's like I was seeing the movie and hearing the dialogue and
Yeah.
everything. So I was visibly there. And
Mm-hmm.
so so I would hear the dialogue,
Yeah.
and, um, but I wasn't in my home. I was like transported to another time and place. That's how it worked for me. And no matter which character I was writing, if I was writing in my grandmother's voice, I was my grandmother. But I was always visualizing everything. So it was easy to write because I saw it all.
I know so what you mean, because I can absolutely relate to that. And sometimes, when you write it down and you leave something out, that's what I heard. Yeah, but I know what I'm writing. I have seen it. I've been there, like you said. Can't you
Ex-
see it as well?
Exactly. It's right there. But I think that's how I read though too. So that's why it's easy for me to do it. I don't know how other people read, but when I read, it's completely visual.
Yeah.
And that's maybe why I don't do well with audiobooks, because reading is a visual immersive experience for me. Um, eh, so yeah,
Yeah, you know what they said years ago? There's an expression I heard about reading, and the German expression is Lesen ist Kino im Kopf.
is what's the keynote?
Uh,
Cinema in the head is
yeah,
the movie in the head.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Oh, okay. Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's a movie in the head. Right. So
yeah,
writing is that for me as well. Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that is such a wonderful description of reading, or what happens when you read, or at least for me, and obviously for you as well as when you write. It's absolute perfect description.
Well,
Yeah. Despite the Männerschnupfen.
I think we should.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
also
Yeah. No, that's perfect.
oh, same here. Audrey, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
Um, well, I think that I I don't know if you wanted to talk about publishing at all. I was,
Go on.
that was, I was I did try to get an agent. I don't know how hard I tried. I maybe sent out like 20, 25 query letters and wasn't successful. So I got a little discouraged, but then I took another year and did a lot of rewriting. So I was like, well, that wasn't a bad thing. And then I went directly to a publisher. And on my first, shot, the publisher was interested, and I went to somebody who specialized in this type of literature. So that was, I thought, very, very good. So again, I just tried not to be discouraged by, um, uh, rejection, because rejection can be a good. Gave me time, I think, to make the book that much stronger and better.
Yeah.
So, and then I have a website with lots of information about the book and a gallery of pictures. It's audreybirnbaumauthor.com, which I would, be happy if people visited. And I'm on Instagram and, all those things. Audrey Birnbaum author is usually where you can find me on social.
And I just say I'm looking forward to your next book.
Thank you so much.
Because mystery and challenges and interesting characters, bring them on, bring them on.
I have so many. I think, also I met, as a doctor, so many interesting people and so many interesting, neuroses, desires, anxieties, tragedies, so many windows into the world of human nature. It was a great gift to be able to do that. I love my career. Don't get me wrong. It was a marvelous experience, but also taught me a lot about human beings.
Oh, yeah, I suppose it has. Audrey, it was wonderful to have you on the show. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you.
The pleasure was entirely mine. Thank you so much for having me.
And I will join you shortly in the green room. Please don't go away. And I will just say my goodbyes to our listeners. Dear listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. And I'm frozen again. Happens all the time. Technology, a pain in the backside. And please don't forget to like and subscribe. And we hope you will be back for the next episode. Until next time.